Grace Hansen. I'm the dramaturge, which essentially is kind of the interpreter and person who is very familiar with the text so that I can answer any questions and help to kind of break things down in terms of Shakespeare.
What does ILD, I-L-D mean?
Thank you.
I've never seen that.
I feel like it's how we would say it would be ill, so like I-L-L.
Ah.
And I feel like
You should be.
The past tense of ild? The past tense of
you'll see too, because this was as close to first folio as you could make it. They didn't have standards for spelling. If you see a word that's spelled wrong but close enough, you'll see it spelled 3 different ways throughout the whole thing. He didn't pick one. That was just the way that they did in Elizabethan, because not everybody was taught how to read or how to write. So if you were, there was no alphabet, you were just kind of like thrown up there.
Yeah. So dramaturg, it's interesting because in other industries or facets of art, it means a little bit different. In this context, in a theater, dramaturg is mostly that person who's seen many interpretations, who knows the text really well and is able to explain it in a lot of ways. It's also just somebody who's there to provide context for time and help in any explanation way they can.
Inverness is just, I feel like it was picked, it's a capital kind of in Scotland. It was a trading town, there's all of these things, but it's also got a lot of mythical lore behind it in the sense of witches. And that part, like Shakespeare didn't make up, but it's known for stuff like that, which is why it's often picked as a setting in any mythical thing that happens in Scotland, as well as it. So it's a hub. Witches liked to be there, and I think I feel like that's why it was picked. If you study Scottish and Irish witch lore, if you look at all of their myths and all the things behind it, Inverness is a big pull. Partially because of just geographically how it looks, and then partially because of the people who live there and the stories that were told, but that's the hub. If witches were involved, Inverness was also involved somehow. The druids were there, all of the things.
So how I prepare for the show is I've read it many, many times. I've studied it at length, and I have read many different versions of it, which always have slightly different footnotes, which are good to kind of collect as little trinkets of knowledge. For the day-to-day rehearsal, I don't really prepare for it. I like to hear it again as they're reading it, and as we go, I'll write down everything I remember, or I'll pull the text apart as we're going, just so that it's fresh, because there's always going to be something that I think is particularly interesting when reading it, and that's not always something that's relevant to what we're doing. So if I read it beforehand and I get stuck on an idea, I'm not necessarily as useful because I'm focused on my own very literary part of it, and that's not really what I'm supposed to be there for that day. So I try to make notes as I go, and I always bring my Norton Anthology, which is a book with all of Shakespeare's texts in it, and it has very detailed footnotes, and I like to bring it as a reference in case I forget something, because Shakespeare can be complex, and there are words that we no longer use, and it's always good to have that reference point in case something comes up as we go. When they said the rump-fed runyon, they do mean the fat, rumped, mangy slut. So it is possible, that's literally what the translation is. So it's possible that they are looking for other things, but I think it's just as possible that she was like, ha, you're cheating on your husband, and that's a strife. And if we're following the line that they are like the Morgan, feeding off of strife, the fact that she called her out on it and she just said, go away, which he was like, that's helping to gain power to get those chestnuts so that they can see a clearer picture of how they're going to manipulate Macbeth. All they know at the beginning of the play is that they're looking for him. It's possible they don't know who. So if they're the witches, right? So if it's possible at the beginning that they know they're looking for Macbeth. That's a big enough power that they don't have to use very much power to see it. Until then, to get a clearer picture before they meet him, they're feeding off the battle and all of the dead. They're feeding off the spirits, but they could also just as easily feed off the strife. So they find she has a pilot's thumb who was wrecked homeward. That's bad luck. It's probably good for them. It's that same kind of thing. She's cheating on her wife. I'm going to go over and point that out to her and cause all sorts of guilt and grief and things. Just as much strife as they can, they're going to go and collect it all so they see a clearer picture. So by the time that Macbeth gets there, they know exactly how to manipulate him and exactly what strings to pull and tie. Okay, so this is the Norton Shakespeare. It's my prized possession. I take it way too many places because it does weigh 6 pounds. And in it, it's a very detailed anthology. You'll find other ones, like Oxford has one. There's a whole bunch of them. Within it, there are detailed essays about everything. There's this nifty little thing, which I love. There's a timeline for all of the history, because a big part of Shakespeare is talking about the historical context, and Macbeth is no exception to that. There's so much history embedded in all of it. So it talks a lot about what was going on at the time before each play. So there's an essay talking about historical context and textual context and rules. So within it, you'll find things like sumptuary laws, which are laws dictating what people were allowed to wear at the time. And that's very important in Shakespeare because theaters broke a lot of rules in that way. And it talks a lot about the context of staging through that time. For the plays themselves, they have, this is Macbeth. All of these little bubbles, which you can't see from over there, but they have what the word actually, what they mean, because sometimes it is not what we think it is. Even if it's a contemporary word, it's not the same definition. They're, in a lot of ways, speaking the same language, it's just in a different order. And in some ways, they are speaking a different language, even though we have the same language. And then at the bottom, there are footnotes explaining sayings, some of which Shakespeare completely made up, which they specify on, and others that have been lost to history, except they're not lost. They're in this lovely book that is very heavy. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff in there that way, and as well as timelines, again, which are always useful in the context of Shakespeare, or most things. But yeah, this is what I bring to every rehearsal, just in case I need to reference something, or I've forgotten something, or I kind of think I know what they're talking about, but I need to make sure that I'm right and not running off on my own thought trains, which happens. The scene that Lady Macbeth, the little monologue that she's delivering before Macbeth enters, she's talking essentially about the fact that her child is dead. Her role before any of this was going to happen was to be a mother, and that role has been taken from her. So there's a lot of debate to what unsex me here means. A lot of it, a big portion of it is she doesn't really believe that Macbeth will follow through on this plan, and she knows that she can do it. She's got the plan, she's got it all figured out, she can handle it. The other part of it, though, is often interpreted that because she no longer has this child, because this purpose is gone, she's completely free to find a new purpose. So the imagery that's often used, and Caitlin pointed it out, is, and take my milk for gall. Her milk's dried up, or she had it, and there's no more child to feed. So instead of feeding this child, she's going to feed this new purpose, which is pushing them forward.
You knew that one, right, Paul?
No.
Oh.
Okay. The big context for the two of them, he's kind of dealing with PTSD, kind of, we're thinking, and he was in all of these battles, and that's kind of where his background is coming from. Mm-hmm. But either right before he left for war or in the course of it, they lost a child. So that's where a lot of her kind of trauma comes from.
And what line is that?
It's Duncan's last, or not Duncan, Banquo's last line in his first little speech, and it says, where they most breed and haunt, I've observed the air is delicate. Banquo knew what happened.
Okay.
Banquo is Macbeth's best friend. He knew they lost a child. He knows what it did to both of them.
Got it.
They messed both of them up.
Well, even in the line before that, when he says, no jutty frieze, buttress, nor cone of vantage, but this bird hath made his pendant bed and appropriate cradle, where they most breed and haunt. I've observed the air is delicate. So, suggesting that
Duncan comments on how nice and warm this home is. Banquo knows it was nice and warm for a purpose, and what was going to make it nice and warm is gone.
I always try to have, this is silly, multiple different colors of pens because I like to know the reference point that I made one night from the night before, because sometimes when I look at it again, it's different. So I like to have the text to reference because I also have many notes in my Norton copy of this play that I did not feel like transferring from my textbook to my script. So I like to have my own notes that I maybe took during a class that are always useful because it's not always my thought. I'm using someone with a doctorate in Shakespeare and she knows lots of stuff. So she's kind of in this book too. That's always what I kind of try to do, to have multiple versions and iterations and different things that catch my eye as I go. So it's nice to have the book where I'll open a scene and go, oh, I was confused about that the first time and that's what I remembered about it. And I knew I made a note of it somewhere and I go and find my note. So a lot of times this has all of my notes. I also have a notebook that I brought from, that I just dedicate specifically to this, and it has notes from films that we watched in trying to prepare for the show and the kind of feel that we wanted. So I reference that on occasion to when I notice that the text kind of supports a theme that I found in a movie and that we can put there. It also has things that I noted down when we were doing auditions, and it has notes about where we want to go with certain characters. And I like to have that as a reference point in case I see something where I'm like, oh, that would be a really good support for that, or oh, maybe that's not as relevant as I thought it was going to be, but I have that note just in case it becomes relevant later on. He's never viewed her as just somebody who was supposed to give him an heir. They are equals, they are partners, and that becomes very clear in this scene. She's still dealing with this loss, and they both do, and you'll see it in different times, but he comes in and that is his partner. That's why he wrote to her beforehand, that's why he tells her all of this thing, so when she says, I have a plan, he's like, cool. Figured you would. So my plan for 16 people is a lot of double casting in very subtle ways, but not subtle at the same time. Shakespeare was known for kind of monster casts, and this show, for whatever reason, has a ridiculous number of people. It's probably not actually that ridiculous. There are 2 people in Act 5 that we see in one scene in Act 5, and they ask 3 questions. And really all of that was in Shakespeare's time was those 2 people were in the troupe of actors, and they don't get paid if they don't go on stage, so he threw them a bone. I'm fairly positive that's what that was. So there are certain things like that where we take messengers and attendants that aren't named. Well, you can make those the same people. They're all in the same general area. So that's a lot of what it is. It's, well, this is a messenger and this is an attendant, and we don't see them ever again, so they can be the same person with a little costume change. It's fine. So that was my general thing, was saying, well, these people are dead, so they're not doing anything. They can go and fill this role, which is kind of easy in this play because a lot of people die. There's lots of room for people to not be doing anything, and in reality, just 16 very busy people instead of like 35 people who speak for 35 seconds.